Hi, this is Kathrine Moore, and I have been doing a series where I am covering the sexual ethics policy for the Texas Annual Conference Administration under the United Methodist Denomination in Houston, Texas. Okay, there was a policy I wanted to go back and revisit and unpack. And I'm going to explain why. And after I read this, I'm also going to explain how clergy are appointed to churches under the Texas Annual Conference Administration. All right. So, D, if a mental health professional who sexually exploits a patient or former patient is a member of the clergy and the sexual exploitation occurs when the professional is acting as a member of the clergy, liability, if any, under this section is limited to the church, congregation, or parish in which the member of the clergy carried out the clergy member's pastoral duties. At the time the sexual exploitation occurs, if the liability is based on a violation of subsection A, or at the time the previous occurrence of sexual exploitation if the liability is based on a violation of subsection B. Okay, so here is my knowledge because I took a church careers class. I also grew up under the Texas Annual Conference Administration. My father was employed under them. So, clergy that are pastors of United Methodist churches anywhere in the United States, they are employed under an administration, which has an annual conference every year where all of those clergy gather and discuss policies and discuss the financial budgets regarding that conference that they are employed under. As a requirement of employment, if they are going to become an ordained clergy, they have to go before the Board of Ordained Ministry. And they have to be questioned. They have to be interviewed. They have to go through a psychological evaluation. It's not as simple as they just go fill out an application online and they get called for an interview and get hired or not hired. Now, the larger churches, for example, St. Paul's United Methodist Church on Main Street in downtown Houston, St. Luke's United Methodist Church in downtown Houston, Chapelwood United Methodist Church in downtown Houston. These churches have thousands of members in their congregation. And their pastor, the larger the church, the more responsibilities the senior pastor has. And they need a staff of associate pastors to assist them, and so that they can share these responsibilities, delegate these responsibilities with clergy. And the senior clergy choose who they want their associates to be. Now, these larger churches, they will have a committee that will select who the pastor is. And how they do that, I don't know. They could possibly get recommendations. The United Methodist Denomination is a connectional system. And so the larger churches will decide which pastor they want to serve. That pastor will become employed under the Texas Annual Conference Administration. I'm just talking about in the Houston area, any church that is under the Texas Annual Conference Administration, the larger churches. Oh, also Windsor Village. That's another one. Okay? So the congregation will select who they want to be their pastor. Every year, the cabinet, which consists of district superintendents, which is over, the conference is divided up into districts. And the head of each district is called a district superintendent. This would be who the clergy answer to. This would be their supervisor. And so these clergy are required to be informed and educated on the sexual ethics policy, the safe sanctuary policy. And they have to go through continuing education every year. And so the smaller churches, the cabinet will meet and they will discuss and compare the needs between clergy and what a specific congregation may need, what type of pastor they may need. And the cabinet, along with the bishop, will assign clergy to specific churches. And then these clergy will move. There'll be a certain moving day assigned. It's usually in June. And these clergy will move to their newly assigned churches, including the clergy who were selected by the larger churches. Now, the process when a church selects their own pastor is usually called a congregational church. Now, the only churches that are involved in that would be the larger United Methodist churches. However, they are still under the Texas Annual Conference administration, and the policies still apply to them, even though they are able to choose their own senior pastor, and that senior pastor is allowed to choose their staff, their associate clergy. And so what the policy that I just read, the problem that I have with that is that they're saying that the congregation is responsible, but the majority, only a handful of churches, get to select who they want their pastor to be. And that pastor is still employed under the Texas Annual Conference administration and placed on assignment at that church, even though that congregation selected them. And these clergy have to go through extensive training. So it would not make sense if the congregation is held responsible for misconduct by a clergy. Even if the clergy doesn't appropriately handle misconduct by a church member, because the clergy are in a leadership position. They have the authority to address any misconduct that goes on. And trust me, there's plenty that goes on within the Texas Annual Conference. So, Michael Tabb, for example, he was appointed at First United Methodist in Troop, Texas. And he was employed under the Texas Annual Conference administration. And he was sentenced to 55 years in prison for murdering his wife, brutally beating her beyond recognition in a United Methodist parsonage. So it would not make sense if the congregations are responsible for misconduct perpetrated by clergy that are employed under the Texas Annual Conference Administration and were placed on assignment at that church. Because the cabinet is the one, along with the bishop, that makes that decision. The clergy have some say, not a whole lot, and the congregation really doesn't have a whole lot of say. Now, there are times when congregations are not happy with the pastor and want a new pastor. And it really depends greatly on the situation and the circumstances and the details that are discussed with the district superintendent, which then are discussed with the cabinet. And it would not make sense why the Texas Annual Conference Administration settled with Alicia Provost Whitfield out of court if, according to policy, they were not responsible for Kendall Graham and his wife luring her into their home so that he could sexually assault her as a minor. And the only reason why they would is because they didn't want it out in public. And Harrison Fisher leaked the document in my paperwork, which is why I know her identity. And I don't owe her any loyalty. And I don't owe the conference any loyalty. And I don't owe Harrison Fisher any loyalty. When my kids have been placed in a compromising situation and forced to visit me at a United Methodist church that is under an administration that employed their grandfather, who was a child molester, I do not owe the conference any loyalty. And Alicia Provost Whitfield went right back to Harrison Fisher after he leaked her document. So I don't really have much sympathy for her, because I sure as hell would not have gone back to the attorney who failed to comply with attorney-client confidentiality. That was his fault. He was the attorney. He signed an NDA with the conference administration, I'm sure. And so did she. And I had a conversation with her. And he was also just as cruel to her as he was to me. So this policy doesn't make sense. Because what they're doing, what it sounds like, is they're using a word salad to complicate things and keep people confused. So that it sounds like they're being thorough when they're really not being thorough. Because there's no way a congregation can be held responsible when the congregations of these smaller churches, like the church that Kendall Graham was assigned at and the church that Michael Tabb was assigned at, they don't have, they're not in the leadership position. The pastor is, not them. So how would a congregation be held responsible? What would the purpose of a larger administration being over these churches if they're supposed to be held accountable? Besides, usually it's swept under the rug and nothing is done about it. In fact, what really happens that's not said in these policies is that the Texas Annual Conference will retaliate against any sexual assault victim that speaks out, because they want their victims silent. Because in their mind, if you're going to cry about something, they will definitely give you something to cry about. But I grew up around that. So I'm pretty calloused. And it did knock me down to a certain point. But I am stubborn as hell, and I am not someone who just gives up easily. This is unethical. Also, so if the congregations are supposed to be held responsible for the misconduct, then why would the United Methodist Denomination write a pathetic letter of a pathetic apology letter and have bishops read it at annual conference to clergy, which are the ones who are most likely to perpetrate abuse to vulnerable people, women, children, and adults in their congregation? I mean, if the congregation is held responsible, what is the point in reading a pathetic, cowardly apology? Because you don't have the ethics or the integrity to assist the people whose lives have been greatly affected by trauma from abuse within the United Methodist Denomination. And before Marla Tabb was murdered in Troop, Texas, there were signs. In fact, I watched the Dateline video of that. I should have recorded it. I wish I had, because it's disappeared. How convenient. And the way she was portrayed, and I don't know if the Texas Conference had anything to do with it, or if the United Methodist Church and Troop had anything to do with it. She was portrayed as somebody that was cruel and mean and difficult to get along with. But she was beaten, brutally beaten beyond recognition. And let me tell you, before it gets really bad, there are red flags. And most of the time, people ignore them. I've done it. And because of that, I found myself in an abusive marriage. And I've had to deal with an ex-husband who has abused me legally and abuses our sons. No one in a domestic violence situation is pleasant. I've been in multiple shelters, and you don't see a woman come in a pleasant mood in a domestic violence situation. You don't see rape victims come in who were sexually assaulted the night before, that are there because they need a place to stay and get their shit together because they were assaulted. They're not coming in there happy and pleasant and making small talk and saying, hey, how's the weather? Yeah, by the way, yeah, my husband beat the shit out of me last night, but hey, it's cool. I mean, how was Marla Tabb supposed to act? People had to bring food because she couldn't come outside. The way it came across to me, the way that she was portrayed in the media as someone who was just not a kind person at all, just very difficult to get along with, very unpleasant. Seemed to me like it was more about victim blaming than about seeing her as a woman who was in a traumatic, difficult domestic violence situation, and it cost her her life. And it cost 2 young children a relationship with their mother. And the person responsible for that was employed under the Texas Annual Conference Administration, not the United Methodist Church in Troop, Texas. He was placed on assignment there, but he was employed under the Texas Annual Conference Administration. That story sticks with me, and it will for the rest of my life. And what her family was put through is inexcusable. So, this policy is garbage. Absolute garbage. I'm going to read the next page. Okay. Which is 18. 17. Okay, this is going to be E. Nothing in subsection D shall prevent the extension of liability under this section beyond the local church, congregation, or parish where the current or previous sexual exploitation occurred as appropriate under the section D. If the patient proves that officers or employees of the religious denomination in question at the regional, state, or national level, 1, knew or should have known of the occurrences of sexual exploitation by the mental health services provider, 2, receives reports of such occurrences and failed to take necessary action to prevent or stop such sexual exploitation by the mental health services provider, and that such failure was a proximate and actual cause of the damages, or 3, knew or should have known of the mental health professional's propensity to engage in sexual exploitation. Let me read that again. Number 3, knew or should have known of the mental health professional's propensity to engage in sexual exploitation. That is shameful. That really is. But I know. The Texas Annual Conference is immune to shame because they're a multi-billion-dollar administration. They don't have to worry about the lives they destroy. Let's see. Section 81.004, damages. A plaintiff who prevails in a suit under this section may recover actual damages, including damages for mental health, mental anguish, even if an injury, or other mental anguish is not shown. You mean like if a parent who is forced into supervised visitation is forced to visit her sons at a United Methodist church that's under the Texas Annual Conference Administration and is a survivor of sexual assault, repeated sexual assault by one of their clergy, and is also sexually harassed on the property in the building of St. Stephen's United Methodist Church in front of staff of St. Stephen's United Methodist Church and in front of staff of the Domestic Relations Office of Harris County.